Hi everyone, welcome to Dennis Deep Cuts, the 33rd installment of this fine YouTube series. Today we're going to talk about crossover, specifically crossover hardcore, more specifically crossover hardcore from the 80s. Let's see what happens. So before I became a punk rocker, I was a complete metalhead. I really wanted to play music, but all the dudes around me, and yes, they're all dudes, they were super proficient players because they've been honing in on their skills in the bedroom for years and years and years. I didn't have honestly, I didn't have the patience to do it. I'm a bit of a restless person. The discovery of punk and hardcore enabled me to actually start a band and to play music and go down that path. I always felt like a lot of metal was too complex for me, basically. There are multiple things that lead you on these paths, but one of the most important things for me was crossover hardcore. Crossover hardcore being essentially hardcore bands that put out a cool record and then they put out another record and they got into metal and then they changed the sound slightly. Or, you know, a band where two guys are into metal and two guys are into hardcore and then that becomes a mix of that. And it made complete sense. It had the aggression, the energy of metal, but the songs were short and they're a bit more simple. And that sort of led me into punk and hardcore. So today we're going to celebrate that. We're going to talk about 10 crossover hardcore records that I really love. It's not a top 10 list. It's more like here's 10 great records. Some of them I bought in the 80s, some I bought when they came out, and some are Stone Cold classics, and some I bought more in modern times, you know, as the journey of discovery of music continues. I'm going to do a playlist down below, so you can check out these songs if you want to. There's also a whole world and a whole scene of metal bands that are really influenced by hardcore, and that might be a list for another day. But there's some truly fascinating, truly awesome stuff in that world as well. But now, without further ado, let's dig into some crossover hardcore music. Let's do it. I would say that a massive reason why crossover became crossover is that when you start playing in a punk band, because it's a pretty common theme amongst almost all these records that you start out as a punk and hardcore band, and with the premise of like anyone can do that, we can all play, and it's 3 chords, it doesn't matter. And then as you become better at playing, you want to develop your sound, you want to develop your skills, and for a lot of people, I think metal made sense. Metal had a big impact in the early 80s, parallel to sort of hardcore. So a lot of bands, a lot of people were influenced by speed metal and heavy metal and thrash metal. And it made sense that people went that direction. I mean, you have other bands that went in more mature rock direction, or you have a band like TSOL that went in goth rock direction. But I don't think it's linked into the way, you know, you play. Like you become a better player, so you move in a slightly different direction. And we also have to remember that in the early 80s, hardcore was still kind of a new thing. So one of the bands I think that really fits in is Battalion Saints. They're a San Diego hardcore band that started in the early 80s, in 1981, I think. They put out an excellent EP in 1982 called Fighting Boys. That's kind of like hardcore classic. And then in 1984, they put out their record Second Coming. And the 2 years in between, a lot has changed. And the attack is different, the sound is different, the sort of the guitar has more like the metal edge to it. It's still kind of a hardcore record, but you can hear that they're influenced by speed metal and like early heavy metal. They do a pretty awesome cover of Motorhead's Ace of Spades. Usually I don't think people should record Motorhead songs, but it's great. It's like it's sped up a little bit and has that hardcore edge to it. I think this record is fantastic. It's just from start to finish a hardcore, metally hardcore masterpiece from 1984. So it's also kind of early in the days of what will become crossover, because a lot of that stuff is from the late 90s, late 80s, of course. And this is from 1984. Botanical Saints broke up in 1985, and then they got back together, as every band does. And I think they're not playing anymore because someone recently died. But Botanical Saints, Second Coming, it's a great thrashy, crossover-esque type of hardcore record. So the next record I want to show you is one of the first crossover records I ever bought, and it's definitely a record that really sort of influenced the way I wanted music to sound, I guess. And I am talking about Crumbsucker's Life of Green from 1986. Crumbsucker started in Long Island in 1982, and they were part of like the early New York hardcore scene, and they sort of redefined their sound. So I mean, it is very much hardcore, but the songs are short, and there's like 15 songs on the record, but they all have this really metallic edge, a lot of like dun, 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 on the guitars, and his vocals are great. They're kind of gruff and weird. And this record is just, in my opinion, a Stone Cold classic. In 1988, they released Beast on My Back, which is, I think we were all a bit disappointed when we bought that record. After that, they kind of broke up, or they morphed into a band called Heavy Rain that you can check out on YouTube. The singer left because he felt that the musical direction that they were going in wasn't really what he wanted to do. And the other guy started a band called Heavy Rain that's not that great. But Crumbsuckers were great, and Life of Dreams is just, from start to finish, a fantastic crossover record. So the next record I want to talk to you about is from Canada, and it's Beyond Possession from Calgary. This record is pretty decent, decently new addition to my record collection. Started in 1981, I think they broke up in 1989. This album's from 1986, and they have a 7-inch out before that. 7-inch is a bit more like skate punk, but a little bit of a metallic edge to it. And this record is just full-on crossover. I think it sounds, reminds me a lot of Corrosion of Conformity, maybe the Animosity record, that type of like really thrashy, like desperate vocals. And this is a fantastic record. I think they were working on a follow-up when they broke up, and I guess that's it. But Beyond Possession is a really, really cool, sort of wild and aggressive crossover album that it's not very expensive, and it's really good. So you should buy it and listen to it. Let's head over to Italy for the Sheet of Chrome motherfuckers with their 1986 record Into the Void. Sheet of Chrome motherfuckers started in 1979 in Pisa, the Leaning Tower in Italy, and they broke up in 1987. Their first 7-inch and their first demos are some of the most relentless, chaotic, and most insane hardcore you'll ever hear. It's just fantastic. And by 1986, it's not really a fully formed like crossover record, but they slowed it down a little bit, and the songs are a bit longer, and they definitely have a metally edge to it. It's still kind of chaotic, and it's still super wild. It reminds me a little bit of Void, you know, from the Void, Faith Void Split LP. That sort of metally tinged chaotic hardcore. But as I said, they slowed it down. It's a more mid-tempo record. The songs are longer, and it's just a wonderfully messy, chaotic type of record. It's recorded by Paul Marn from the Zero Boys in 1986, and it's also released in 1986. They were touring the States, and they were like, let's record a record, and it's a super cool record. They have a song called Crushed by the Wheels of Industry, and I thought it was a Heaven 17 cover. I don't know that it is. If anyone knows, please let me know, because I try to Google, and it's like, it's I can't find any tracks that it is, but it's the exact same titles. I was a bit confused. But this is a great record. Into the Void, Sheet of Chrome motherfuckers. All their stuff is worth seeking out because it's just relentless, raw, wild, chaotic, crazy. Yeah. Next band needs no introduction. Chromax, best wishes. Age of Korra could have been the record. Chromax is a very fascinating type of band, and they have a very complicated and complex and problematic history. Um, I might dive into one day. I kind of want to do one of these, like the best to worst Chromax records, just to be able to talk about them a little bit more. They started in New York in the early 80s, massive lineup changes, and this is their second record. Singer John Joseph quit, got fired, who knows. So Harley's singing on this record, and I like John Joseph singing a little bit better, but Harley's doing a great job. I remember I'm buying this record in the city, and I was on the bus on the way home, and I was reading the lyrics, and I was chuckling to myself, thinking, "Oh, this sounds like it's like a metal record." And when I came home and put it on, I'm like, "Oh, it is a metal record." This is a super cool, very metal crossover type of record. Chromax with their first album, Age of Korra, was one of the bands that really defined that New York hardcore sound, where you took metal and you took like that heaviness, and you still had hardcore songs. This record has longer songs that are way more metal. And I mean, Chromax, they toured with like Exodus and Venom and Motorhead and stuff like that, and you can sort of hear what they're going for. Yeah, it's just a super cool record, and you got, I mean, Chromax, problematic, but you gotta love it. So maybe one day I'll do a Chromax episode where I just talk about the Chromax. So one of the best crossover albums of all time is, of course, Suicidal Tendencies. Join the Army came out in 1987. It's one of the first hardcore / crossover records that I ever bought, and I really fell in love with it. And you know, all their stuff up until like the early 90s is pretty phenomenal. Not going to talk about Suicidal Tendencies, but I'm going to talk about a band that's so connected to Suicidal Tendencies that it could be the Suicidal Tendencies. And I'm, of course, talking about No Mercy with the album Widespread Bloodshed, Love Runs Red. I talked a little bit about this earlier when I did their American Hardcore Compilations episode, and I talked about the Welcome to Venice compilation. So No Mercy were a band. They put out some stuff, and then the singer left, so Mike Muir from Suicidal Tendencies started singing. After the first Suicidal Tendencies records, there were some problems with the label, and there were some problems with the fact that Suicide couldn't really play in LA. So Mike started singing in No Mercy, but at the same time, Suicidal Tendencies was still playing music. In 1987, Suicidal puts out Join the Army, and it's the same year that No Mercy puts out this record, which I love Join the Army, but this is a superior record. Maybe a bit more metal, maybe a bit more like, it's a bit faster, and it's a bit more, you know, aggressive than the Suicidal record. After this record, they were working on a second No Mercy record, and it didn't materialize because someone left the band, and then I guess Mike Muir and maybe the bass player decided that we're going to take all these songs. And so a lot of the No Mercy tracks that they were writing after this record ended up on the How We Like Laugh Tomorrow record. It's a fantastic album. And if you hear this record and you're thinking to yourself, if you love Suicidal Tendencies and you hear this record, you're like, wait, I recognize a bunch of these songs. Suicidal put out a record called Feel Like Shit Deja Vu, also I think it may be in 1988. And it's 4 of these tracks, but re-recorded with Suicidal, plus one track with the short-lived project Los Psychos, which is also a Mike Muir project. But this record is a phenomenal crossover record, and I think it's if you love Suicidal Tendencies, you should have the No Mercy record, because it's like kind of the same thing. It's a bit more metal, and it's a a bit more aggressive than Suicidal, but it's kind of the same thing. And I think this is a stone cold crossover classic. I think everything in that world, like Suicidal record, they put out the first Beowulf record, that's phenomenal. They put out the first Excel record, that's great. The No Mercy, the Welcome to Venice compilation. It is interesting that that little world, they're all like doing that crossover thing, and they're all doing it pretty fantastically, pretty great. So check out all that stuff from Venice Beach. It's just great. Let's head down to Brazil. Ratos de Parao with their record from 1989 called Brasil. Ratos de Parao started in São Paulo in 1981 as a pure punk band. They did some numerous lineup changes, and the constant in the band was, of course, Jao. That was, I think he was first the singer, and then he was the drummer, and then the singer, and then the guitar player, and then Gordo came on and started singing. That's like the classic versions of Ratos de Parao. They broke up for a short minute, then they came back, and they were more into metal, and they're more into crossover, and they're best buddies with Sepultura, and all the punks hated them and thought they were sellouts. But they did put out some fantastic crossover records. This one, they went to Germany to record it, and it just sounds great. This is a very like intense crossover, late 80s type of hardcore record, and it's great. I think Ratos de Parao is still a band, and they still tour and might still put out music. And yeah, you should check it out. Some Brazilian crossover hardcore. What can go wrong? It's interesting when things go full circle. I want to talk about the Exploited. Specifically, I want to talk about the Exploited, the Jesus is Dead 12-inch. It came out in 1986. Exploited with their early records such as Horror Epics and especially when we made Troops of Tomorrow were a massive influence to a lot of the crossover hardcore bands. And by the late 80s, Exploited also got influenced by metal and crossover, and they put out, especially the 1987 record Death Before Dishonor and The Massacre that came out of that. They're just pure crossover thrash records. Jesus Dead is still kind of punky, but it has that metal edge to it. And I think, I love Troops of Tomorrow. That's also one of the records that, one of the first punk records I ever heard. But I love this EP. I think Death Before Dishonor record is pretty good, but this EP, all 4 tracks are killer tracks, and it's just great. There is a weird period in the UK where bands like Exploited and GBH and even Discharge, they went metal. That's a whole episode in itself, the Discharge metal years. It's quite interesting, and I think Exploited, out of all those bands in the UK that went metal, I think they did it the best. I think the energy is still there, the attack is still there, and the songwriting is still there. So I think that if you want to check out some Exploited going metal, then check out Jesus Dead and then the Death Before Dishonor, and maybe The Massacre. I think The Massacre is pretty awesome as well. So yeah, Exploited from Edinburgh in Scotland. They're still around. It has like 10 heart attacks and he's still on stage ripping it up. It's pretty awesome. All right, let's talk about a crossover band that's really influential in sort of defining the sound of crossover, but they didn't really get a ton of recognition for it. I am talking about The Accused out of Seattle. This is their 1987 record, More Fun Than an Open Casket Funeral. They started in the early 80s as more regular punk and hardcore band, and then the singer from the Farts came in and they invented what they call splattercore, which is like, it makes a metal punk with like a lot of like goofy horror lyrics. But the sound that they had really defined crossover, thrashy crossover in a lot of ways because of some excellent guitar playing. I bought this record in the 80s, And I was really confused by the way it sounded because his voice is insane, but like in a good way. And the playing's pretty awesome, but at first I was like, what is this? Like, what am I listening to? And I think that's a good sign. They put out a bunch of cool records in the late 80s, early 90s before they went on a really long break. And you could see some of them in the grunge band Grunt Truck in the 90s before they reformed. And now we have this awesome situation where The Accused is a band and they're putting out records and they're touring, but it's a guitar player. And then you have The Accused AD, which is the singer who's also supposed to put up music and be touring. It's a bit weird, but you know, people's egos, people's lives. Anyway, check out The Accused. More fun than Open Casket Funeral or any of the Marta Splatterhead's Revenge or whatever they're called from the mid to late 80s. They're pretty awesome, really metally driven, guitar driven hardcore crossover music of some kind. Yes. And the question you ask yourself is there going to be a crossover list without DRI? And of course not. DRI, third record, crossover, maybe second album, depending on how you see it. DRI started in Houston, Texas in 1982, I think, and they relocated to San Francisco. They put out the Dirt and Rotten EP in 1983, which is, and then Dealing With It in 1985, and then crossover came in 1987. Dealing With It is one of the first hardcore records that I ever bought. They did like a reissue of it, and it came out, and you know, I bought it maybe 1987, and it blew my mind. It's so fast and so intense and short, aggressive songs. And then I bought Crossover probably around the same time because I was super enamored with Dealing With It. And this record is very different. It's I mean, it's called Crossover. It's like a, you know, here's the mission statement. This is going to be crossover. And there's definitely a lot of tracks that are longer and have like very metal guitars to it, but it's still also super fast. And kind of you can hear the old DRI, but it's like they do the short, fast songs, but now they're just longer. I remember getting a hold of the Live at the Ritz VHS, which we watch over and over again. And then I think it made more sense because maybe if you heard this record out of just, you heard it without context, you'd be like, what the hell's happening? But when you saw it live and you saw the reaction of people, I mean, I love this. And I still love this record. I still think DRI is a phenomenal band. I've been lucky enough to see them live a couple of times, and they just still rip, even though they've been working on a new record since 1998. If that ever comes out, I would definitely do an episode about, like, you know, with the compact records. But I'm looking forward to it. So DRI, if you're watching this, do it. Put out a new record. I'll be pretty stoked. I would definitely buy a copy of your new record. And there you have it. 10 great crossover hardcore albums that you should check out. Playlist down below. Next week I'll be doing something completely different, and in 2 weeks I'll be back with more nonsense. Tell your friends to like, share, and subscribe. Well, you should like, share, and subscribe, and tell your friends to check it out. Until next time, stay wild, my friends. Bye-bye.